So, welcome to Explore with John McFall. We're going to be delving into innovation with Amazon. So, according to Gartner, 89% of executive leaders say customer obsession is a priority, but only 11% say their organization actually acts on it. Amazon doesn't just talk about customer obsession, they engineer a process to force it. That process is called working backwards, and it's why they launch with precision, not PowerPoint. In this section, we unpack how the process works, how it transforms decision making, and why most companies get it wrong. So, we're going to be joined today by Eric. And Eric, I'm going to get a quick intro from you, and then we'll jump straight into the interrogation.
Sure. I was with John at Amazon myself for about 10 years. And during that time, I had several roles, but all throughout they were involved with innovation. So I ran the professional services business in Asia. I ran the advisory business in Asia, and I ran kind of like a chief people officer style role globally. But all of it was involved with innovation. In fact, formerly when I was head of advisory, innovation was one of my core services. And about 2 years ago, myself and several other folks from the Amazon Working Backwards world moved over to Korn Ferry to create a Amazon Working Backwards advisory business to help large enterprises adopt basically the Working Backwards process.
That's brilliant. And Eric, it's great seeing you again, mate. It really is. It always feels like a lifetime, but the work that you did across Amazon, not to overstate it, with 10 years worth of experience driving innovation at some of the world's largest, if not the world's largest organizations. And I think also what was interesting, whenever you and I were working together, was that we were also charged with driving innovation within Amazon Web Services, so the world's largest cloud computing business, which had become it was growing so fast. It was just hard to maintain the culture and the ethos across that business. So it was absolutely fantastic to see how you personally, tackled that challenge. And I suppose what I'm keen to do is just to unpack it a bit more with you as we go through this section. And one of the things that we talk about a lot on Amazon, and suppose then it just becomes something that people know, is that we talk about working backwards. But I really want to just understand a bit more about why it's why is working backwards not just more than just a clever framework? What is it?
Well, I think we should make a distinction between working backwards, the framework, and working backwards toolkit, which is an implementation process. And let's start with Amazon working backwards, which is sort of I think of it as a framework or a philosophy, actually. And it comes from this fundamental idea that Jeff Bezos had, that Jeff wanted Amazon to be a company that was customer driven. Now, I say that in difference to, let's say, competitor driven, right? Companies that focus a huge amount on what their competitors are doing and how their products are actually built in positioning, in competitive positioning. That's the features are defined by what the competitors are doing. You could also have sales driven company. You could have business model driven companies. You could have technology-driven companies. I think of Google as a technology-driven company. But Jeff was very clear that his focus was going to be on customer-driven. And so this idea of working backwards from the customer actually is not specific to innovation. It is something that drives every aspect of Amazon. So we start with this idea that fundamentally at Amazon, everything is customer driven. That means the way you do performance management is customer driven. The way you hire is customer driven. The way you innovate is customer driven. The way you run governance everything is customer driven. That's the idea. And essentially at the heart of it, we're just asking what can we do to drive delight for our customers? And in the innovation space specifically, we're going to be looking at how do we launch products that are not just going to make a lot of money out there, but they fundamentally start with happy and delighted customers.
Okay, so that's a useful way to sort of frame it, and I like the idea of reframing how companies could organize themselves differently, and that Amazon very firmly positions itself as a customer-driven organization. But maybe you could delve into a little bit more about what the components of the working backwards process hour in general terms?
Yeah. So well, if we just talk about working backwards, it's both very easy and very hard. So the easy part of it is that the way that we think about new product development or innovation. And by the way, I will talk about new products in this hour, but we really need new solutions because these could be services or products. It doesn't matter. In fact, working backwards, as you mentioned, it works both with external products. I'm like in, say, a B2C situation where I'm creating products for consumers, but it equally works if it's internal. So if I'm creating new services for other employees, that also counts as a, a working backwards moment or working, a place where we can apply working backwards. Um, but whatever the case, as we launch new solutions, there's many ways to do that, right? So if we think of a technology-driven company, then that technology-driven company is going to come up with what's my cool tech that differentiates me, what's special about my technology, and then how do I productize that? That's sort of the fundamental starting point of a tech-driven company. With a customer-driven company like Amazon, the question is, where are the customers suffering? Where are they unhappy? And what solutions can I provide to delight them? And really, the easy part of working backwards is it's actually a very simple process of coming up with what's called an Amazon press release and then adding an FAQ or set of frequently asked questions. And in that process, essentially, what the press release does is it tells you, pause before we come up with our solution features. Let's start by understanding the customer and what they would look like if they were delighted in, let's say, 3 to 5 years. So a press release is a future document that kind of describes how the customer would be delighted at the point of launch or maybe 1 year after launch. And so then from there, from understanding what delight looks like, we then would work backwards to feature set. So the press release gives us our North Star in terms of customer delight, and then we come back to our cubicles and we start building towards that. But it gives you that North Star. And the FAQ portion of it, because we often say PR FAQ, the FAQ portion is a set of predefined questions which Amazon knows that, well, customers want to know the answers to this, but also internal stakeholders want to know the answers, like how much does it cost? How are you going to make money doing this? And so the frequently asked questions are sort of a stock set of questions that we all would need to answer as an appendix to a press release. And from a working backwards and innovation perspective, that's pretty much all there is to working backwards. The magic comes when you align all of the other aspects of the organization, from setting strategy to hiring to performance management to everything else. When you align all of that stuff up together, it becomes an incredibly powerful way to deliver delight to the customer.
So I think what I want to do before we jump into the sort of how we implement the working backwards process and empower, maybe we could just reflect a little bit on the PR FAQ component. And one of the things that I'm both good for and bad for is good fairy, good idea fairy idea generation, right? So there's lots of things that are really good ideas, and there's lots of things that are really innovative solutions, and there's lots of things that we could do differently. And my goodness, you could reinvent the world, especially over a couple of pints of beer. We can solve almost any problem. But tell me a little bit about how the press release and FAQ format really helps sharpen clarity and importantly, kill bad ideas early so that we don't go too far down the journey.
Well, I would actually say, if I could talk a little bit about the working backwards toolkit, which is slightly different from our classic working backwards. And the working backwards toolkit came about when the professional services organization in AWS, where we were, many customers were coming to us and saying, hey, we see that Amazon is incredibly good at innovation. We suck, or we at least perceive that we suck. And in fact, according to Harvard Business Review, 85% of products launched to market will fail. And so generally speaking, everybody sucks at innovation. And so they come to Amazon and they say, listen, you seem to be very impressive in this front. Can you help us rethink or transform the way we innovate so that we cannot be failing 85% of the time? Maybe we're failing 65% of the time. but even 20% benefit is massive from a bottom line perspective. And the original attempts to take just the press release and the FAQ and make that part of, and essentially take that to customers and say, hey, we'll teach you how to write a press release and an FAQ, didn't work very well, because those companies needed more than just, they needed all, like, for instance, program governance. In program governance in strategy, we have something called an operating plan 1 and an operating plan 2, or OP1 and OP2. And the press release is when we decide to implement a press release, that then goes into a program inside OP1, OP2, and then it's submitted to this larger mechanism called MBR, monthly business review, where we're constantly checking on progress of programs and making pivot, persevere decisions every month. And if you don't have those mechanisms in place, then you end up with a press release, but it's very hard to implement that in a structured, disciplined fashion. Then it just goes through all the normal processes, and innovation gets sidelined and sent into eddies or whatever else. And so we were not doing well in helping other companies adopt working backwards. And when we talked to them about what was going on, which is part of working backwards, we talked to these customers and said, what's stopping you? What's getting in your way? And essentially what it was is that they knew they weren't going to have the Jeff Bezos. They weren't going to have the leadership principles. They probably weren't going to have OP1, OP2, or MBR, because they were their own companies. And what they really wanted to focus on is new product development and not complete company transformation. They didn't want to become Amazon. They wanted to stay themselves and just bring in aspects. So what was clear is that what they needed is a set of hands-on practical tools, and not a framework, and not a philosophy, not a way of thinking, not saying that let's start from being customer obsessed or customer driven and work backwards from there. Those are nice words, but they're very hard to execute, right? So what they really needed was a set of practical hands-on tools that they could just deploy and that would drive similar outcomes. And so that was the birth of the Working Backwards Toolkit, was really bringing in a set of practical tools from many disciplines, by the way. The Working Backwards Toolkit takes in Lean Six Sigma, design thinking, agile, all, basically every lean startup, all these different ideas, and merges them into sort of a package which a company would need if they wanted to deploy working backwards. Fundamental to that is the idea of experimentation. And this is where I come back to your original question. So fundamental to that is this idea that we probably, we know for statistically 85% of the time failure, we know that we actually don't know the answers at the beginning of any program. And essentially what's going to happen is the customers or the project itself will tell us later what truth is, because things will fail and they won't adopt. And so you need a way to quickly get your ideas out there to be tested by the true market and the customers. And the faster you can do that, the faster you can learn. And that means as you learn, you're going to change. Sometimes you might change your requirements 100%. You may end up doing what's called a hard pivot, where you're doing something completely different. After you spoke to the customer, you realize that they didn't need what we thought they needed. They need something else. And so that might actually lead you to come up with a completely new press release. But this idea of experimentation ultimately comes from the scientific method. And in the scientific method, if you think back to grade school or primary school, right, you have really 4 stages. So a scientist will start with observation, where they're just kind of looking at nature, trying to identify patterns, things that seem to occur over and over in the same way in a predictable manner. And then they come up with a hypothesis to define that prediction, like what I think is going to happen given the circumstances. And then we run experiments to test whether that happens in the real world. Does nature actually behave in the way that our hypothesis predicts? And then we analyze the results of those experiments. And so either we say, hey, the predictions were totally validated and this seems to work, or the prediction didn't go the way we thought it was, and let's start again back at observation and come up with a new hypothesis. And this loop, if you will, doesn't have to only apply to nature. We can apply it to a subset of nature, which is product markets. And we can ask the question, how are markets going to respond to these products that are being launched, and apply the same observation, hypothesis, experiment, analysis, apply that exact same process to this question about product market fit. And that's the way that we add this idea of experimentation to the working backwards idea. So we know we need to experiment, but in classic working backwards, we don't tell you how to experiment. That's something that Amazon knows how to do from program management, because we'll use Agile in that case. But they don't give you tools. And so the Working Backwards Toolkit gives you a set of tools by which you can run 3 major types of experiments. So one is called customer validation, where you're asking the question, does this customer really exist? And do they have the problem we think they have? And then solution validation, which is asking the question, can we actually figure out features that will delight the customer vis-a-vis the original pain points? And the last one is business validation, which says, can we actually make money doing this? And so those 3 kind of layers or 3 mechanisms within the Working Backwards Toolkit allows you to apply this experimental process to those 3 product market fit problems. And by the end of it, you get some pretty awesome results. I think last I checked, we were at about 250 million invested in Working Backwards Toolkit spin-out projects from customers. And I think it was 1.9 billion in revenue from these projects since 2019.
So, I mean, do you know what is really interesting as well there, Eric? And it's something that, I admired about the time I had working with you, was the fact that there's the continuous innovation on your own process as well. So there's no arrogance involved. It's not that Amazon thinks that it knows what it's doing and therefore, we're all going to do it the same way. There's a real continuous can we, and what's wrong with our process if customers are not understanding. So I find that really interesting. Now, I remember from grade school that it was entirely possible for me to adjust the data in order to get the result I really wanted, because I'd already wrote the essay. And I remember that it was equally possible for me to satisfy myself that my customers absolutely are listening to everything that I said and that I'm 100% right on this solution by adjusting my understanding of the world. So one of the hardest bits about any sort of scientific method being applied in this place is really a dynamic between the day-to-day operations, the leadership aspects, the initiative that you want to do, the politics and the people, the culture, as it were, of the organization. So how do we help guard against some of those very human traits when we're applying this sort of methodology?
Well, the nice thing again, and we should probably at some point take a pause and talk about mechanisms, but essentially these are all Amazonian mechanisms. And the nice thing about mechanisms is that you can engineer control points into them such that it's very, you have to honestly be lying in order to, move forward when the data isn't there. So you would actually have to be a bad actor, because the tools, the mechanisms themselves will show you the data. So there's control functions within the mechanisms to tell you when you should be pivoting, and you should be careful that you're not suffering from cognitive bias or anchoring or anything else. The other nice thing that they have is, outside of the tools, when you think about the governance process, if you will, essentially what happens is you have to submit your experimental design and the experimental results to your peers on a regular basis to review how things are going. We made that part of our monthly business review. So this is something that's going to happen monthly. And so you need to monthly come back and show what's really happening. And you're being challenged by third parties, right? Other people who are there to make sure that you're not going to be making those classic mistakes. And then the last bit is that at Amazon, it's all about scale, because you can imagine this company is sort of in the millions of employees, I think, and everything has to scale from the beginning to make Amazon work. And as part of that, you get another aspect of the scientific method, which is that in the scientific method, your experiments should be runnable by other scientists. In fact, they need to be. So the first stage is you run an experiment yourself, get the results, then you give the experiment to other scientists around the world and say, hey, can you run this experiment for me and see if you get the same results? And then the third level would be where you say, hey, scientists, this one experiment design seemed to deliver positive results, but can you come up with different forms of experiments that test the same thing from different angles? And so you'll end up with this kind of multi-layer of control points to make sure that you're not falling prey to anchoring or cognitive bias or anything else like that. Now, falsifying data, okay, it's possible, but you would get caught in the process. You would catch yourself in the process.
I think that's the key thing, is that eventually with these mechanisms, you do ultimately realize that you're catching yourself in the process. You had a strong view, you had a strong sense of direction, you had a gut in, told you this was the right thing. But as you go down the process, you very quickly realize that actually what you thought was 100% the path to go down is actually 100% not the path to take. And there are better ways of doing it. But I suppose the real confidence, and maybe it comes with maturity of leadership, it's that willingness to be wrong. And it's that willingness to accept that, okay, we've done the process, we've been thorough in our data assessments, we've been thorough in the tools that we've applied, thorough in the methodologies that we've applied, and we can see that we're wrong. We'll talk about mechanisms in a bit more detail, but my by far favorite leadership principle, within Amazon is that sort of backbone, disagree, and commit component. And often when we talk about that, it's easy if you're the person that's right and you're trying to convince the world that they need to adjust. It's much harder when you're the senior leader and you have lots of people underneath you who have got great ideas and great initiatives that you don't understand what they're trying to do. How do you give them the scope to be able to operate? How do you give them the rope to be able to run? And how do you support them if they fail? Because, it's not I told you so. It's dust them off, set them up, and then execute. So then, Eric, in the supply chain world, working backwards can be, it's often perceived as being particularly tough to implement, because a lot of leaders will come in and say, look, John, it's simple. I want to redesign my warehouse. All I want to do is just update my last mile delivery. The only thing that I need to change is my demand planning forecast. So why do I need to do a working backwards initiative when the outcome is so obvious? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we know from statistics that 85% of those initiatives will fail because lack of product market fit. So we roll out a new demand management system, and then we try to roll it out, and the customers in force say, we didn't want a demand management system. What are you doing? We wanted these other 5 things that are really causing us pain. And so, and again and again and again, right? The Harvard Business Review study is a very strong study, and we just do this to ourselves again and again and again. So that would be a feature-driven business or a technology-driven business, right? Where we say, hey, we're the experts. We know what this is supposed to be. We will build the product for you, and then you'll use it. So that's a technology-driven approach to innovation, and that doesn't work. We know 85% of the time, companies like that will end up launching products that actually don't solve. Not only might they not solve for the customer pain, but the actual customer that they thought existed may not even exist. And so that's why we turn to a customer-driven methodology for innovation, where the first question is to talk to the customers and say, what do they want to achieve? What are their pain points? What are they suffering from today? And then let's deep dive and better understand and better gain an empathy for that. And it probably won't be what our SMEs are telling us it is. It probably won't be demand management. It'll be something else.
All right, so here's what I take away then from that sort of initial discussion around working backwards, is that I take away that so many companies, they want the agility, they want the innovation, but like all of us, they also skip the hard thinking up front. Working backwards, and the conversation we've just had shows us that, clarity, it's more than a process. It's also a mechanism. And what is more, clarity scales. So coming up next, if clarity is the vision, what are the tools that actually help us scale?